Good afternoon, everybody. Um, my name's Hal Roth. I'm the director of the Contemplative Studies program here at Brown, and I'd like to welcome you to a lecture in our series, Mindfulness, Science, and Society. For how many of you is this your first Contemplative Studies event? Well, then I'll make it brief. Most of you know what I'm about to say. Contemplative studies is a brand new academic field that's developing all over North America. In contemplative studies, we look at human contemplative experience, that is, experiences of focused attention and concentration, leading to greater insights and experiences of tranquility. We look at these experiences as they have been derived across cultures and across time. We study them in their contexts, their original cultural contexts. So from humanistic viewpoints, that's philosophical, political, social, historical, and also from scientific viewpoints. There's really an increasing body of scientific research on the nature of contemplative practice and contemplative experience upon which we rely, and we have a number of different contemplative studies research projects, scientific research projects that are being done at the moment, a number of labs. In this concentration, which is the first of its kind in North America, students not only approach contemplative practices from a kind of traditional academic third person at a distance perspective, they also learn what these contemplative practices are from a direct engaged first-person perspective. But it's a first-person perspective that's different from the kind of perspective that we would encounter in a practice center, a monastery, synagogue, mosque, temple, in that in both instances, in both situations, both here and there, we learn what the contemplative practices are. We learn what the cognitive framework is in which those practices are embedded. But here, what we ask you to do is, we don't ask you to believe in the veridicality and the truth of those cognitive frameworks. We allow you to test them out for yourself and make your own decisions. So that's a critical first-person perspective. We've been very active in organizing lectures and workshops and retreats for many years. In the last 10.5 years, we've organized over 150 different events here at Brown to bring a greater awareness of contemplative studies as a developing academic field to the Brown community. And we also try to schedule our events so that members of the outside community, outside of the university, are able to attend. And always happy to see many of you here who are from outside Brown. This particular lecture series is sponsored, co-sponsored by the Star Lectureship Fund, sometimes by the Department of Neuroscience and the Brain Sciences Institute, Department of Religious Studies, and the Interlandi Lectureship Fund. If any of you is considering a concentration in contemplative studies or would like to learn more about contemplative studies, please go to our website. You can find it on the A to Z, and you can sign up for the listserv with a convenient click this button. Our next challenge is to put a donate here button, but we haven't yet been able to do that. So this series on mindfulness, science, and society was developed because mindfulness has really been, it's become a very, very common term throughout North American and European, and I mean, actually throughout the world now. And it's been used in a whole bunch of different ways, and what we're hoping to do as a result of this series is to show that there is actually a fairly specific use of the term and to distinguish that use from other uses. I mean, it really has come to be a kind of more respectable term for meditation, and we'd like to help develop more precision in understanding that term. That's one of the purposes of the series. Another purpose is to really examine, and this is something we do in contemplative studies, what the greater contexts are in which we do contemplative practices. We don't exist as isolated and separate individuals, and it's possible to use contemplative practices to reaffirm our separateness rather than our common humanity. So we live in these greater contexts of the interactions in our interpersonal relations, so they're social, they're political, they're historical, they're environmental. Really none of us, even hermits who live off in the woods, don't live really by ourselves. And so in order to better understand the kind of social and political implications of what we do and how we do it, we have created this series and have brought here today our speaker. Professor Rhonda McGee is a professor at the University of San Francisco Law School. She was born and raised in North Carolina and did her undergraduate work at University of Virginia. Went to USF for law school and, no? UVA. Oh, to UVA for law school. And has been out on the West Coast for quite a while. We first met at probably a workshop of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, and it was really refreshing to see the perspectives that Professor McGee was bringing to this organization to get us to really start to wake up to these broader issues of where these practices that we're studying fit in terms of larger social and political issues. She's become an eloquent spokesperson for bringing these issues of race and ethnicity, diversity, into the discourse in contemplative studies. And it is really a treat and a great pleasure to have her here today. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor McGee.
So can everybody hear me all right in the back there? I want to say, first of all, thank you so much to Professor Roth, my good pal, for inviting me here to be with you. And then I want to say thank you so much to all of you for taking the time out of your schedules. I see some friends and fellows from along the path and some new friends that I just saw yesterday at a workshop that we did on these very same issues, but really giving us a chance to practice together. Today, I'm here to talk to you and really maybe also create at least a little bit of an opportunity to practice together on this topic of contemplative pedagogy for teaching and learning about social justice. So it's a big topic, actually. A lot of multidimensionality to this topic. And for me, that's a perfect reason why bringing contemplative practices is really well suited for the work that we are going to put front and center today. So before we begin, I want to check in. How many of you have some kind of contemplative practice of your own that you would consider to be a fairly regular part of your lives? Okay, so that's actually most people. How many of you already do some teaching, not just necessarily of contemplative practices, but any kind of teaching? Okay, great. And then the rest of you, how many of you consider yourselves learners? Maybe lifelong learners, right? All those, hopefully. All right, so I consider myself a lifelong learner. As Hal mentioned, I studied at University of Virginia actually for not only undergrad and law school, but in between, I got a graduate degree in sociology. I was actually in a PhD program studying how people resolve conflict. That led me to law, but actually that sociological inquiry into effective ways of resolving conflict are probably at least part of the reason why, in addition to looking at law and race. I teach normal, ordinary classes at the law school having to do with personal injury law. I taught insurance law, of all things, immigration law. All right, so I teach all these standard law courses, but I've also created courses that bring a contemplative and praxis dimension right into my classrooms. So what I'll talk about today is drawing on some of the experiences I've had in teaching and learning at the teaching at the University of San Francisco, co-learning in these learning communities that I try and facilitate and co-create in my own spaces at USF. But also, as I indicated before, I consider myself to be a lifelong learner around these things. So, and I consider every opportunity where there's more than one person gathered to be a rich opportunity for learning. So can we, at least even now, imagine ourselves together as a learning community? Again, we may or may not ever see each other in just this particular configuration again, but I trust that there's a reason why we're here and there's some opportunities for our learning together. So I don't want this just to be me talking at you one-on-one. I want this to be to some degree interactive. Can we sort of feel our way into a way in which we might contribute in some ways if I put a question out there? All right, good. I wanted to give us a little bit of a heads up for that. And if you at some point feel like a question is arising, you really would like to kind of have that in the room, feel free to interrupt me with your questions. Is it all right? Is everybody okay with that as a norm for our gathering as well? All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's begin together. I want to just give this overview, just to give us all just a little bit of a sense of how the time will be will be structured, at least from my perspective, and again, I invite you to kind of disrupt that structure a little bit as you feel so moved to do. But we'll begin by really examining some of the challenges to effective teaching and learning about social justice. And I'm assuming that we're talking primarily about traditional spaces for teaching and learning, so traditional classrooms and traditional academic sorts of environments. But as I just sort of suggested, we teach and learn all the time in all kinds of places. There are opportunities for us to sort of teach and learn all the time in all kinds of places. So as we sort of frame our comments, we might be thinking about, again, the traditional settings for teaching and learning, classrooms at august institutions like this one. But really, let's think about all the different opportunities we have, perhaps, for sharing what we know about issues of social justice and injustice that are alive for us or up for us right now, that go beyond just our classrooms, right? So family settings, workplaces, or community organization spaces, places where you might volunteer, your spiritual communities, churches and so on. So I hope as we continue to think about this topic of the challenges, we will be thinking, obviously, about a diversity of settings in which we might, reflect together about this work. So we'll talk about some of those challenges, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, like I'll present some of my own. So be thinking as we prepare for that part of the conversation about some of the challenges you see to teaching and learning about social justice or injustice, as I put it, right? Because we're talking about two sides of the same coin. To talk about social justice is to implicitly be thinking about some social injustice. And then we're going to need to define that term a little bit and open up a little bit of discussion about what we mean by social injustice and justice. So that's what we'll do the first part. And then we'll segue into exploring contemplative practices that I'm putting out there as a thesis for our examination together. That these certain practices actually do work to cultivate insights about the nature of social injustice in particular places and at particular times, and help build capacity, the kinds of capacities, the range of capacities that might be worthwhile and useful for helping us actually intervene, dislodge, disrupt patterns of injustice and bring about greater justice, greater opportunities for thriving for all. So hopefully during the course of this, we'll have at least some opportunity to practice a bit together. Perhaps as we segue into examining how contemplative practices might assist, we'll drop in a little bit of practice. Is everybody at least potentially okay with that? Yeah, thank you. And then we'll go into Q&A and sharing, continuing learning together, exchanging information in a way that I hope will help this be as much of an opportunity for learning for me as it is for you. All right, so that's our frame. Let's begin by identifying and talking together about some of the challenges to teaching and learning, effective teaching and learning for social justice. Before we jump into some of the preliminaries, like what are some of the ways we might define social justice, let me just say for me that I tend to always sort of assume that we're going to be looking at topics like this from at least 3 domains of inquiry, or through lenses that are shaped by at least 3 domains of inquiry and practice. The personal, right? So what are some of the challenges that individuals might face, or that you or I might face, right? Just trying to think together and teach together about issues of social justice. The interpersonal, right? And I want to underscore that these domains are necessarily kind of oversimplifying complex reality. Certainly there is not a sense in which there can be a personal without also an interpersonal. We live in a society in which other people are always already present. As well, we're always individuals in interpersonal engagement in systems and societies and cultures and in complex overlapping systems, right? So there's a lot of complexity here that we're trying to point toward just by identifying these 3, so to say, separate domains of inquiry. But you guys are contemplative practitioners and students, so you understand the idea of complexity overlain with a certain amount of structure to help us simplify the conversation, right? So for purposes of a conversation, we're going to talk about these 3 domains as if, to some degree, we could isolate them for our points of focus, but we understand that they intersect and overlap, right? With me on that? Okay, so thinking about then some of the challenges to teaching and learning about social justice, personal, interpersonal, and systemic institutional. When I think about some of these challenges, again, as I mentioned, I teach at the University of San Francisco. It's a very, it's a diverse law school. It's sort of famously has been identified as one of the top 3 most diverse law schools in the country. But actually, when you walk into my classrooms, it's not like you see, the classrooms look, just from sort of the kind of facial test of diversity. And again, whenever we talk about these terms, they're a little bit crude, are they not? But there is such a thing as sort of facial kind of test, if you will, or ways that we engage these notions of identity by what I will tell you the Supreme Court and other courts historically actually coined the phrase and used the phrase in some opinions looking at race as a factor in immigration historically. They used the phrase ocular examination to determine whether or not a particular applicant for naturalization, this is during a long period in our American history, long and often kind of buried history, in which whiteness was a prerequisite for one's ability to naturalize as a citizen. So we have at least 52 reported cases where the courts at various levels were trying to assess whether or not somebody was white enough to be able to naturalize. And in this long sort of, like I said, somewhat buried jurisprudential stream of cases, you will see courts talking about different ways to determine the race of the applicant. And one of the ways they use, and actually give a name that sounds all formal, is an ocular examination, meaning they just look at a person and determine, is this person white enough under the kind of common understanding of what whiteness means for us to say this person probably meets the test. Now there were other, it's kind of shocking. I see some people's mouths are kind of like, what? Yeah, yes, to all of this, right? You can look up and do some research on your own. There were some more scientific tests being used sometimes, and they were called scientific tests, but common understanding was the kind of corner of the realm. The common understanding based on kind of looking at a person, whether the person was basically white and would be considered white under the norms of the culture. And this was from the 1790 period up until really the early 20th century. This was a feature of naturalization law. We didn't really disconnect from this idea until the 1950s, early 60s. So I operate from a place in law where I know I've looked at lots of different pockets of intersections between social identities, and power, right? Social identities and power. So when I think about social justice, I think about the broad challenge of examining the distribution of resources in societies with a view towards looking at sort of maldistributions. In other words, are there some people who are more favored and have greater access to the benefits and resources of society than others? And are they identifiable by social identities and groups that societies create and recreate over time and give differing meanings to over time and in particular places? And I mention time and place because I do think contexts are really important for helping us understand when we've got an issue of social justice or injustice. We need to sort of look at relevant notions of identity, whether, sort of adopted by the groups or individuals themselves or assigned by others. So we look at groups and identities that might be vulnerable in a particular time and place. We look at the links between those identities and differentials with regard to power. So when I talked about immigration law and could you naturalize or not? That's the law backed up by the power of the state to use force against any one of us, saying race is relevant to whether or not you can become a naturalized citizen. So that's a very, very profound moment of linking these identities, these so-called racial identities. And we talk more about the way those have been defined over time. But the way I just described it, ocular, common understanding, pseudoscience, that's our history in America for defining these things. Very, very loose and rough. And yet, profound implications for the people who were so assigned. Or not, right? People who were contesting to be determined to be white enough to naturalize. We know that race was relevant not just for naturalization, for whether or not you could be enslaved, whether or not you could vote for a very long time, what kinds of schools you could go to. So again, we see there are many different spaces where we might focus, we want to be interested in the intersection between identity and power and access to resources. So the law was standing behind, right? And that's, again, that serious, structured, institutionalized power, standing behind the system that had been created to privilege whiteness in naturalization law, to privilege whiteness vis-a-vis blacks when it came to enslavement, right? And on and on and on, segregation law. And that's just one of the areas of social justice or injustice. We could look at the intersection between race and gender, or gender alone, right? As another place where some sort of social identity was linked with differential patterns in terms of access to power, access to institutional power, with real consequences in the world. So again, for me, often we're looking at questions of social justice, we're looking at a particular society and time and place, and we're looking at individuals and members of that society, and we're asking ourselves, are there groups that are being identified in ways that make them more or less vulnerable, given the power dynamics of that time and place, and vulnerable to anything from violence, physical violence, to economic or sexual or other exploitation, right? So group identity, individual identity, formed differently in different social contexts and places. So every culture does this somewhat differently. Cultures do this somewhat differently. Different places do that differently in one culture, right? So United States, we have all kinds of subcultures and regions. And then over time, these things vary. So you see how complexity is about, right? Whew, well, I have to take a deep breath. Just right? Because right here at the outset, when we try to define social justice and injustice, and to think about some really relevant touchstones for it, right? To talk about social identity, to talk about personal versus group associations, to then ask questions about, well, what's the link between those identities and differentials in terms of power in a society at a given time? So it goes beyond just this mere question of diversity, who's in the room, how many diverse characters or bodies, by whatever test, ocular or otherwise, we sort of see in groups. It goes beyond those questions of representation, which are important, to look at, again, who's in charge? Where are the bases of power? And what are the patterns that we see linking identities, individualized or group identities, however formed, and those sort of various and multifaceted sources of power. So traditional sources of power versus other sources of power are maybe important to think about. Traditional sources I've alluded to, like law, right, and the state authorized access to violence that's behind the system we call law, right? Often hidden back there, but the idea is, well, not when it comes to intersecting with police, it's not so hidden then. But when we think about the application of case law and judiciary, we often don't think, well, the power of the state as executed through this system we call the judiciary and law is to some extent backed up by their power to hold people in contempt of court, right? Put people in jail if they don't follow the law, right? Standing there in the courthouse, from the courthouse steps, the judge has some power, right? Over our freedom, ultimately, right? So that's, I'm vastly oversimplifying to a degree, because we have to for these purposes. This idea of what we mean by law and the power that's really profoundly intersecting with the idea of law. And so when we think about, for me, when I think about social justice, I think about these things. How are the resources and sort of material benefits of society distributed? Are there identifiable groups and categories that individuals may or may not be placed in, or may or may not put themselves in? That when we look at the distribution of power, we see some differentials that can then leave some people, what? More vulnerable to violence, to exploitation, to everything from not getting into sufficient education, to not getting adequate jobs, right? To not getting enough food, to environmental injustice. So do these ideas make sense? Or are there other ways, when you think about defining social justice or injustice, that you also would like to bring to the table? Or do we think conceptually we're at least touching upon some of the things that make sense to you? I want to stop for a minute and just check in and see. As you think about social justice and justice, is there any other dimension? Right? We talked about distribution of resources across given societies. It will vary over time. Individuals, groups, power is relevant. Context, right? So spatial location is actually quite important. Anything else you think might be relevant? Yes?
The news, how information is processed and diluted.
Right. So I have on here kind of power and information asymmetries. And that kind of moves us into that piece of it. So yeah, so whether and to what extent there is sort of an issue of injustice that some of us may see or be aware of might be influenced by, again, these sort of differential degrees to which information is disseminated about these things. And sources of information vary quite a bit. Media is one, but education is actually also a source of disseminating information, who's in charge of what's taught, et cetera, et cetera. When we think about teaching around these issues, first just trying to define what we mean, but then looking at some of the other challenges. Up here I have social and emotional dynamics. I mean, how many of you, just as I've been talking about these things, are starting to feel yourself in some way, some part of the body is reacting in some way? Like what? What kinds of feelings or sensations in the body are coming up? Ah, yeah. Yeah, like so a little bit of, she says, not as open or a little bit tense. How many of you feel a little bit of that? Like the anxiety that can come with trying to look at these issues. Any other sensations, thought, emotions? Did I just yell out one? Yeah? Excitement, yeah.
Wow. There's a lot there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, actually, I do this because I actually do get a little bit of a charge of excitement in bringing or helping be a part of conversations where we together, from our very different backgrounds and places, might engage in a conversation about this. So there is, for me at least, offsetting the sense of anxiety. What will happen next? What will someone say? Will there be something out there that I don't expect, right? Or, some sadness or concern I have where sometimes I'm worried if somebody is not ready for this conversation, if their anxiety level is going to a place that I as a compassionate person, human being, from my own contemplative practice, I don't want to make people anxious, right? So I think that's one of the, if I was to speak to myself as I seek to create a space where we can have these kinds of conversations. I am mindful of, for example, research that talks about how, again, our different positions, right? So social and emotional dynamics, there's more we could say here. Is it gonna come back? Yeah, let's see if it goes. I don't know what happened there. There are all kinds of barriers, really, to understanding and connecting that might come up. And again, just to look at the barriers is a little bit concerning. There's also, let's say I could change the slide. Let's say I could change the slide right now. I'd say barriers are also opportunities, right? They are. But, there are opportunities to look at. Okay, I come into this conversation from a particular place, meaning I have a particular kind of positionality that's born of the sort of particular journey I've traveled here. And every single person in this room has traveled a unique, and I would just venture to guess, would be incredible and beautiful and poignant. We would laugh, we would cry if we listened to everybody's individual story, right? That's, the beauty of literature. It's what makes, I think, life worth living and travel exciting. We get to know and learn about each other's unique stories. But at the same time, given that we each have just our own story, that makes it a little bit challenging to kind of really connect with another person. There's gonna be some blind spots. For example, when I moved to San Francisco from North Carolina, where I was born and raised, when I say Carolina, it sort of comes out the country girl in me. I'm gonna start saying y'all. But in San Francisco, I was surrounded by people who were many of whom were more recent immigrants than what I had seen in North Carolina at the time when I was growing up. And I'll out myself as having been born way back in 1967, yes. And so growing up in the 70s and 80s, in North Carolina, it was mostly black and white at that time. And in Virginia, mostly. And then moving out to California, and now I've been teaching at USF for almost 20 years. I've had 20 years of seeing students, classes of students who are much more, coming from all over the world, recent immigrant families. And so it didn't take long for me to realize that I had a real blind spot about the experience of recent immigration for people. Literally, I'd grown up in a bubble around immigration issues. In North Carolina, in the segregated southern town that I lived in, it was, the part of town that I lived in was still quite segregated for the period that I lived in there. We moved up north to Virginia pretty quickly after a bit. But my kindergarten class in 1972 or 3 was still officially segregated. Brown versus Board had happened in 1954, and then another iteration of Brown in 1957 for law geeks out there. But anyway, Brown was a 1950s case, but by 1972, still no desegregation effectively in Kinston, North Carolina, where I was born and early raised. I have a lot of information then about what it's like to kind of help participate in desegregating the South. Busing, dealing with breaking those things down. Absolutely no information from my own personal experience about immigration issues. Zero. So actually, one of the reasons why I decided to teach immigration was because I was teaching these classes about race and law, and a lot of my students were coming in looking at it through the dual lens of their racialized identities and their statuses as, recent immigrants and having some relationship to immigration law that I didn't know about. So I wanted to learn more about that, actually. So that is what I say, these are barriers and opportunities. The blind spots that we have, the biases that are kind of like the sort of expected consequences of the fact that we can only live one life at a time. So while we might be kind of, uncomfortable about the idea that we have biases, on the other hand, it's like, well, of course we have biases. Like, we have only lived our particular lives. We have been kind of, you know, sort of successful in certain specific contexts, or else you wouldn't be here, right? We all have been successful in certain kinds of contexts, but we don't know a lot of other contexts. We also know the kinds of things that we've been evaluated, you know, the characteristics and standards by which we have, you know, managed to move ahead. We sort of know something about those dimensions of merit, let's say. But if there are other ways that people might be performing well and might have skills and merit, we may not know, if they're not incorporated in the systems where we have thrived, we might not be in a good position to evaluate what is meritorious about other people's experiences. Does that make sense? So these are the kinds of things that give rise to what we might call bias, patterns, relevant but unlearned histories. And in my notes I wrote down, well, histories and contemporary incidents. Things are happening all the time, but both, we learn some parts of history, some things we don't, right? You know, some of us learn a lot about, I know a lot about American legal history at the intersection of race now, but I didn't know a lot of these things before I went to law school. And then, you know, those of you who are teachers in the room, we really learn when we have to teach. So over the years of like reading these cases and really looking at our history around race and law, from Native Americans to Asian Americans, and again, those racialized in those ways. And I use the phrase racialized because, or the term racialized, to mean the process by which races are made, because I do think these are constructions that we hold. And so a contemplative approach to all of this is to kind of take a deep breath and realize that we've been thrown into a world, right, that has been engaged in these processes of making these identities have meaning and relevance in our time. The laws I just alluded to is just one set of places where that racial meaning has been made over time. It's led to patterns of privileging certain races, let's say, or genders, or intersections, religions. And then some people are less so, so subordination, privilege and subordination, kind of two polar dynamics in tandem. All of that is happening. And so from a contemplative perspective, to try and sort of find our way into ways of holding this complex set of dynamics that we, again, mostly inherited. We didn't set about to create these patterns, right? I mean, okay, I'm gonna speak for myself. I did not set about to create these patterns. My presumption is no one in this room, right? We've been thrown into a world where these things are ongoing. And yes, we have some agency. So I do want to say that's another kind of level of the complexity. That there are these patterns and things going on, and each of us can do everything we can to disrupt those patterns. So if women are not supposed to be in STEM, we can get in STEM, right? Or if African Americans aren't supposed to be law professors, we can get in there and become a law professor, right? So there are things we can do. We have agency. That doesn't mean these patterns aren't still kind of persisting and making it harder for some of us and easier for others. And so being with all of that, I would say that the reason why I'm here today is because over the 20 years of teaching and learning about these dynamics, it's become clear to me how important having some kind of personal contemplative practice really was. So I had my own meditation practice before I started teaching these things, but over the years, it just became more of a source of deep, like grounding support, so that all of the challenges that arise when we're trying to look at these things, my own emotional reactivity, let's say. I'm reading about some new thing, some new massacre I just learned about, some new Native American massacre I hadn't heard about, just reading again for this year's class. You know, and it just, the fact that it happened in the 1860s doesn't make it feel less painful, for me anyway, to read about hundreds of people being massacred to clear a certain area in the Southwest, you know, who were known to kind of really be expecting the US government to come in with some kind of treaty or some kind of peacemaking project, and they came in really to clear the land and did so. And so to read, these are varied histories, relevant but unlearned histories, and I'm just always still learning. So just this year learned about this, this new kind of incident. It hurts me to read these things, but I have a contemplative practice. So what it does for me, it doesn't make me, it doesn't pacify me to the point where I think, well, I can sense into the fact that we're all one underneath all of this, which I know we are. I know that these are all fictions, these categories don't really, they're illusions in many ways. I know this, like in my bones I know this. And yet I also know real people get hurt because these things are real in the world. So we've made things real that actually don't need to be. And so having the capacity to turn to these realities and to ask myself, well, where is injustice happening today that I may be blind to? It's not just the unlearned histories. So learning, as sort of looking at the news just a little bit over the last couple of days and seeing that here in Rhode Island there was a gathering of people who were sort of naming the rise in hate crimes here in this state, right? And standing together and saying, never again means never again. That was a phrase used by one of the speakers at this protest that just happened yesterday, here in Rhode Island, where people were naming that there had been a swastika incident, right? And there had been these recent, arisings of hate actions, and coming together to say no. But I didn't, I could have been blind to that. They didn't necessarily have to do with me. So it's a decision I make to not be blind to that, to pay attention, right? So it's looking at these dimensions of our lives is actually a kind of a choice. It's not an easy choice to make. We could cruise through. And so part of what we want to think about together is the particular role that contemplative practices that most of us have in this room, the role that they play in helping us develop the capacity to actually analyze, turn to, develop a voice, ally with other people, stand and say never again when we need to, and then dance when we need to, and sit together when we need to, and break bread together when we need to, right? Live together in community. So barriers to understanding connection, I've got microaggressions and subtle threats, other subtle threats or harms. Is there anybody who doesn't know what microaggressions is? Okay, so wow, okay, great. So the whole room is at least familiar with the term of microaggressions. It's interesting, this idea of microaggressions, these sort of subtle, stunning insults, degradations, often unintentional, not always unintentional. Every once in a while, somebody will intentionally kind of microaggress, that people have reported as part of our institutional lives when we are bringing together people from different backgrounds. So these instances of kind of microaggression are not uncommon. They've been with us for years. Actually, Professor Roth, Hal and I were just talking about some microaggressions that he experiences in his own life. I won't tell his story, I'll let him tell his story. But we all have experienced some kind of way in which people have taken, we've all either experienced it ourselves or maybe witnessed it. Someone taking another person, seeing them through the lens of some kind of identity and sort of disrespecting them, either explicitly and harshly or subtly. So jokes, not giving certain people eye contact systematically, asking certain people where they're from, but then asking them, no, where are you really from when you suspect some kind of way. You want an ethnic answer and they're telling you I'm from LA or whatever, right? But you kind of suspect there's an ethnicity in there you want to suss out, or others in your presence have done that. People who are routinely met with that question, even though for you it might just be, I'm just trying to get to know that person. But if, from the standpoint of the person who is constantly getting this, well, what are you is another way. This one comes out. What are you? If if that ocular examination by which we think we can identify people's backgrounds fails us, look at you, I can't quite tell. Well, what are you, right? And that's a question that some people get and other people don't. And I've heard and sat with the students who get that kind of question enough that it is a scar in their lives. So when we, we just think it's just, we are curious and we walk away, we don't realize that might have been the 10th time that person's gotten that question in the last 2 weeks. And I have students for whom it's that frequent. And it is not, it's not harmless. So on the one hand, this whole idea of microaggressions is something that comes out of the social psychological literature, an opportunity for us to learn something about one of the challenges that can show up in mixed communities, and to sort of see things from the perspective of the other. Contemplative practices can help us hold that information, right? Because there's research that shows they help build empathy, actually. So the capacity to sort of pause our own story long enough to put ourselves in the shoes of another person and imagine what it might feel like. Even though, again, it's not our experience. We have a blind spot about this. But for this person, it doesn't feel so great. Having the capacity to do that is something that research is showing us contemplative practices can help us build. On the other hand, there's another piece of it. I should mention that positionality, right? That each of us enters into these dynamics from different points of privilege, oppression, tending to be a target or tending to not be targeted. Does everybody understand when I point to the notion of positionality? That when we enter in these conversations, we're not just having our own personal narrative and history, but you slot that into these systems of power and access to kind of help us understand, are we more or less privileged with regard to this or that identity in this particular space? Our positioning. And that'll vary again. My positioning here might be different from my positioning on a football field. Right? Maybe be a little bit more, even as a black woman, I'm a black woman that comes in as a professor, right? So we have these different dimensions around which we might have some experience of some privilege, some experience of subordination, all operating in the same body, operating one way here on this campus at this time in this space. Very different if I throw myself, onto a football field in the middle of it and try to start talking about these issues with a clicker. I'm not going to be as privileged there. Somebody's going to, maybe run me down and get me off the field, right? So we have where we are matters, and where we are even in a particular town may matter. But so with regard to these dynamics, you link positionality with this question about microaggressions. So some people might be in a position in a particular place, they'll get microaggressed against more commonly. I've alluded to that already. Some people get these questions, where are you from, and some people don't. Or on a particular campus, some people have the experience of people crossing the street when they walk through, or not giving them eye contact. Some people don't. That's the link between, against whom are these microaggressions more common in these particular spaces, right, than not. Our positionality may make us more or less vulnerable to them, right? So if you're less likely to be targeted, then mindfulness can help with empathy as one thing. And also just becoming more aware, because we know mindfulness practices, the awareness dimension of them, or contemplative practices, will raise our capacity to just take in more information, right? Just be more aware, perhaps non-judgmentally. On the other side of this, though, if you will, and I don't like binaries, but let's just say if you tend to be targeted, then you've got a different set of things to work with. If you tend to be targeted around some dimension of your identity, how can contemplative practices assist you with that experience? Is there a way? Or is this all just about what if you are, one of the privileged who isn't likely to be targeted? So this is, again, hard to even talk about, because to really get us into this conversation, we have to acknowledge that we're going to be in different positions around all of this. And so some of us are going to be feeling like we're more or less targeted. So we're like, well, wait, how does contemplative practice help me there? Well, I think there's research that seems to indicate for sure that, to the degree that a microaggression might arise in a setting, these practices can help us with emotion regulation. So whereas we might feel very vulnerable and hurt and might want to lash back out, with these practices, we can kind of ground ourselves and find a different, more productive response. Stereotyping is an example of a kind of a particular form of a way in which we kind of categorize people based on, you know, sort of cues we sort of perceive in the way they're presenting that we think link to concepts or ideas we have about groups like this. So we think certain things about white men or certain things about Asian women, whatever these sorts of stereotypes. Again, social psychologists tell us we all do this. It's a way of just getting through the world. So stereotyping is another example of kind of a microaggressive moment. If somebody feels like somebody says something, oh, people like you are going to be loud, I need you to sit back here. People like us are loud? What? Right? Or you guys look too urban to come into this restaurant right now. We can't let you, I mean, what? Stereotyping. And if you are a victim of those, again, part of the way contemplative practices might assist, sort of being able, again, to regulate emotions, but also research has shown that the risk that you will be stereotyped actually has an impact on your performance. How many of you heard of this phrase, stereotype threat? So raise your hands high if you've heard of stereotype threat. So the rest of you haven't. I'll just briefly say this is, again, actually a recent social psychological journal named Stereotype Threat as one of the 10 most significant research findings of the last decade. This finding, this idea, comes out of Claude Steele, who was a professor at the time at Stanford, moved on to Columbia and Berkeley, and a group of researchers who were looking at what happens when people think they might be stereotyped with regard to some kind of performance that they value. So what happens to women who are taking tests to evaluate their capacities for science or math? And in a situation where somebody has raised a stereotype that women maybe shouldn't be, right? Some kind of nonsense like that. What happens to their performance? Over and over again, we've shown if a person is sensing a threat of being stereotyped and having their performance on some valued activity confirm a stereotype, that potentially might confirm the stereotype. The way I perform might confirm it or not. Time after time, the stereotyped group, the target group, has their performance go down. So this is a finding that helps us understand performance gaps of many kinds. So in other words, if you've got students who are similarly situated in terms of scores and capacities, and one group is feeling the cue that their stereotyped identity might be relevant in the space, you got to work to make sure your performance doesn't go down. If somebody raises some stereotypes about your group, that you start to play with your mind and start to kind of affect how you perform. Well, there's some research that has indicated that students who might be targets of stereotypes actually perform better if they have mindfulness practices as a support. It's a way of kind of inoculating us, them, I mean, we all might be vulnerable to different types of stereotypes at different times from the effects of stereotype threat. It's been shown. Again, we need more research of this kind, but there's a lot of evidence that mindfulness practice help minimize bias generally, help us to deal with the anxiety of talking about these issues together, help deal with potential stereotype threat, and on and on and on. So all of these kinds of challenges and barriers to helping us figure out what's going on, raising our awareness, right, can be facilitated by some kind of practice. So the question we can turn to now is really what are some of the tools and methods? And we'll kind of wind our way toward Q&A at this point, but I want us to be, because I've alluded to some of those tools. Some of the ways that these practices, so mindfulness practices that allow us to remember, right, again and again, who we are from the standpoint of fully embodied beings. So bringing awareness to the sensations of breathing in a way that allows us to come out, get out of our head, right, and ground ourselves in our beings. That's one example of a kind of contemplative practice that's been shown to help us become more emotionally aware, more able to regulate our emotions when they get triggered around all these issues. and able to meet other people, notwithstanding these challenges in groups. So tools, resources that might assist us in dealing with multiplicity, complexity with heart. So what are some of the ways that the practices help us with this? And what are some of the practices? So I mentioned mindfulness, right? Just basic, simple sitting awareness of breath practice. And that is a practice that has been shown to just minimize our tendency to stereotype other people. That's been shown in research. And again, some of the research that I'm referring to, a bit of it is on these slides, and I'll make the slides available to Hal. Other research findings are in articles that I've written, and I can certainly make those available as well. But these studies are showing that, again, as compared to people who have no capacity for mindfulness, when we measure outcomes on implicit bias or other tests before and after a mindfulness intervention, you see a decrease in the reported sort of biased responses to different outgroups, whether it be based on race, age, mental illness, all kinds of different categories against whom we find biased responses typically. Meditation has been shown to kind of disrupt and give us at least an opportunity to think more clearly, to align more with our values, rather than operate from these often unconscious moments of bias that are embedded. What other kinds of practices have been shown to help deal with these issues, or might you think could help? Other kinds of practices besides simple mindfulness. Any thoughts? Yes? Metta. Yes. Metta. For those of you who don't know what metta means, loving kindness. And indeed, research has actually shown that metta practice, loving kindness practice, does a number of things. One, it can help create a stage for us to have this kind of conversation. So we might have, now that we've had this conversation, the next time we gather around this topic, of course it won't be me, it might be somebody else, it might be in a classroom that you're teaching, a class you're teaching. If you can, you might find a way to bring a loving kindness or metta meditation into that space, whether it's a class, an organizational space, a volunteer space. Metta or loving kindness meditation has been shown, again, to help people get into a space where they can hold all these complex emotional realities, learn these unlearned histories that are painful to learn, and stay in a learning community that can continue to grow and develop together more effectively. The metta practice has also been shown, along with simple mindfulness meditation, to reduce bias, to reduce the amount of bias on implicit associations by unconscious bias measure tests. So there are all these computer tests that you may or may not be aware of that help us identify when we've got unconscious biases. Loving kindness meditation somehow helps. So again, what I often think about is we're trying to find ways to, in these spaces, in these difficult conversations where we're trying to teach and learn about these topics, we're bringing together groups of people from all these different diverse streams of background. And we're actually trying to enhance our capacity to think critically together. We're realizing there's an interpersonal dimension to critical thinking. We actually need to learn from each other, hear from each other. We need to know about diverse perspectives on the world because our own is going to be limited necessarily. And if we want to help contribute to truth finding or sound policy making, we actually need to be engaged with a diversity of perspectives. And in the ways I've already alluded to, contemplative practices and pedagogy can help. This is a picture of one of my classes. I actually take them on retreat. This is a retreat spot. And, this is the end of the retreat day, so they're smiling for many reasons. But we do, right, end up engaging around these issues over time with the sort of the practices in ways that brings people together. So a wide variety of contemplative practices might be used, obviously, right? This is actually the inside of the retreat site that I use. We do, this kind of basic sitting meditation. So anything from sitting meditation, movement, we walk together, we do silent or individual walking meditation, we do the group meditations practice that some social justice practitioners have engaged in through a walking meditation outside together in silence. There are different ways, in other words, that I've been experimenting with bringing these practices in as a ground for these. Now we turn to the difficult. We're not bypassing it. We're turning right into the difficult together, and we're inviting everybody's voice in. This is a kind of a community mindfulness class that I taught in San Francisco. These were community activists who said, we need this too. We're on the front lines trying to change and address injustices in San Francisco right now. Can you offer this? So I did I can't remember, 6 or 7 week mindfulness course with that particular group. And that's a picture from that. And this is just an example of, again, the interpersonal practices, mindful speaking and listening practices that can be brought to bear. Eating together a certain way, right? I mean, there are all kinds of, listening to music, right? There are all kinds of different types of practices. This is a kind of a famous tree of contemplative practices that probably you've shown. Yes, the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. You can get a copy of this at their website, contemplativemind.org. Because you can't read it probably from here, but at each branch, it gives us an example of a different kind of practice. Journaling, pilgrimages, storytelling, contemplative storytelling, really fine way of helping us hear each other's perspectives and get our positionalities right on the table. What I know from experience, what I don't know, at least some aspect of it. And so on, right? So this is meant to just say, there are many different ways we can do this. And I'm totally open to hearing the ways and thoughts that you would bring to bear on how we would do this. But again, the idea is that there's a way that engaging in practices that help us deepen our sense of reality and how we relate to it. So sitting and really examining the nature of reality, helping us see through these notions of identity and difference and see, that they are kind of acting, they look real in our lives, but actually from the lived experience of contemplative practice and awareness, we realize that who we are is completely not it's not subject to being reduced to these identities. We are, these kind of magnificent, I don't even know how to name really what it is to be alive. We have these terms, these words, these identities. They don't capture who we really, really are, what life really is. So to be in this sort of soup of non-binary, it's not this, it's not that, and at the same time, these things are mattering in the lives of people. People in the world are being hurt because of these ideas. Can we hold both, right? Can we have this sort of, these things are mattering here and now, and I'm going to stand with these people for justice. And then when I need to sort of step back from that and just sit and be and, behold, I do that too. Or we're doing it maybe all at the same time. I'm standing with you for justice, and I'm beholding that you are not limited to this identity that's vulnerable right now. You are not. You are beautiful. You are this, the stuff of stars that we can't even fully name. Right? So can we hold all of that at once is what I think. I think the answer is yes. I think contemplative practices are perfectly developed, capable of helping us do this. And I use mindfulness not a lot in the classes that I teach at law school, but again, there are lots of other practices that can help us dissolve these barriers, make them into opportunities, as I alluded to before, helping us understand and see things more deeply, helping us examine positionality and context without shame, right? And realizing, these things can be true and we might need to do something ethically to respond, but it doesn't mean that we are bad people. We're fundamentally good people struggling with problems we didn't create, but trying to make a difference in the world. So, again, just sort of bringing this kind of engaged practice. You've got your practices. Now how do we take them into the world? I've written about what I call color insight, moving from color blindness to insight, about race, for example, and the way it plays out in the world. But that's just one example of an area where we might just really bring our contemplative understanding more deeply to bear. Again, this just gives some idea of what I mean by color insight. We're taking traditional practices and we're bringing in bearing witness practices, contemplative storytelling practices, some restorative justice circles, all trying to basically give us a space where we're not turning away from the racial dimensions of our lives and the different ways we experience it, but we're learning about each other through deeper engagement with this. And again, my articles on Color Insight are published and are available if you're interested in more exploration of how I've done these things. So all of this is about increasing our capacity to see, to be more deeply engaged with these problematic dimensions of our lives on an ongoing basis. We're not just going to a workshop or having a class. We see this now as part of our practice lives. That is really my pitch or the way I hold all of this. This is just a dimension of our practice lives, period. Helping us deeply live the awareness that we have of our interconnectedness, and honoring all of your individual lives and stories as we go. So again, here's some of the citations that I alluded to. Again, they may be available through the Contemplative Studies program. And so here's my question to you. What are some of the thoughts that are arising for you as you think about bringing the contemplative dimension into engagement with social justice work? Do we need to sit for a little bit? Can we sit together for a little bit with this question? How about that? How about before we just jump into conversation, I'll ring the bell and I'll do some light guidance for us together. So coming more fully into awareness of your embodied presence in this moment. Sensing into the way in which you are supported in this space by the ground beneath you. Noticing the position of the body in the chair, feet on the floor. And just allowing yourself to fully come home with non-judgmental and loving, kind appreciation for your being in this moment. Your embodied being in this moment. And just allow yourselves to just fully accept all of who you are as you breathe in and out. As much as possible, bringing your attention to a point of focus on the sensations of breathing in and out. This sort of gentle, non-judgmental awareness to our embodied being in this moment. And inviting a measure of sensing into the way your particular embodiment does intersect in the social world with ideas of identity and categories that you may or may not embrace. Just bringing awareness to what arises in you when you think about the identities that meet you in the world. Is there some sensation in the body, or is there numbness? So sensations, emotions. And gently hold the part of you that is strong enough to look at this issue, these issues in your life. Perhaps compassionately holding yourself literally with one hand over the heart, one hand underneath the belly button. If you feel you need, and really many of us appreciate a little bit of compassionate holding in these moments. So now, if you're willing, just holding with yourself with compassion as you breathe in and out. And extending the wish for well-being to yourself wish for fully embodying your innate goodness, your strength to stand up to those things that are difficult to see, with compassion for yourself in this. May we extend the wish for compassion to everyone in this room. Those all around us here. See if you can fully imagine extending compassion as far as possible in a forward direction, behind you, to your left and to your right. The wish for loving kindness. May I be filled with loving kindness. May we each and all be well in body and in mind. May we be safe from inner and outer danger, including ourselves in these wishes. May we each and all be truly happy and free. This slide, first of all, thank you. Let's gently transition from that moment of settling in back now, sensing into ourselves as members again of this beautiful learning community. Sensing into the quality of the heart and the body, having engaged in that practice. Maybe the quality of the sense of the room. Maybe taking a moment to gently see if you can look around, see the faces of the people in this space with whom you've just been sitting with such kindness. Really see if you can take each other in a bit. And these are just a very abbreviated example of the kinds of practices I routinely bring to my students when we're trying to do this work together. So we engage in the practice and then we continue the work. It's a practice and the work together. So the work piece for us is thinking about what kinds of practices we might explore bringing in to the work that we might do. Teaching, learning, leading, how we might do that, what kinds of questions arise for us when we think about trying to do this together. And so what kinds of questions or observations, concerns are arising in you as you think about all that we've experienced here together? Yes. Please tell me your name, although I happen to know your name, Justin.
My name is Justine.
Yes.
I teach, and one of my biases is that I'm assuming in any given room, and sometimes I think I know exactly who I'm thinking of. I'm assuming there are people who are not going to be open to this kind of mindfulness practice, and who will perhaps judge and disrupt it. And so I'm owning that perhaps I'm putting that on people, and maybe it's there, maybe it isn't, but that is a barrier for me in doing that in a group, particularly in a classroom.
So, thank you, Justine. Is there anybody else who has a similar kind of concern? Yeah? I have that concern too. I think I don't do this lightly. I've had my own personal mindfulness practice for more than 20 years, and I was born in a household where I saw a grandmother engage in a regular practice of Christian contemplative practice every morning before dawn and then go off and take care of, another family and help us get off to school. So I was raised in an environment where it just seemed like a normal thing to do to make yourself as strong as possible in a world that might be challenging for any of us. So I have that capacity, but I'm aware that many people might not be comfortable. So I do think thinking about how and when to introduce these things is really, really important. And there is no cookie cutter formula. One must, I think, have your own personal commitments, as most of you in this room already acknowledge that you do. Keep working on those. Because it's from the ground of practice that we sort of divine and sense what is called for in a particular place and time. Again, there is no template. I would not say, these are the 5 things you should do to start a class or to talk about this topic. It kind of should, and I have to admit, Arthur Zions, who's a friend of mine and Hal's, who has been a leader in this field of contemplative pedagogy, has taught a lot of us the value of allowing our practices to be a guide for our own inquiry about how and when to introduce these things, into what settings and what practices, and what kinds of preparation might be appropriate there. So just the light preparation, for example, that I did at the very outset. How many of you have a contemplative practice? There are ways that, and signaling, we might do a practice together, right? So signaling that if somebody is uncomfortable, they could have just scooched out of the room right then and there. But those are some of the kinds of things that I do. And then by now I have certain classes where everybody knows that if you sign up for this class, you're signing up for some practice. And then other classes where I sometimes just have everybody pause. I don't guide people in mindfulness, but it's a moment for people to drop into whatever kind of resources and silence might be of benefit for them. So a stealth way of doing it versus a very explicit way. And I think it's, again, based on what seems to be called for in the given space. So good question. I see a hand up here as well.
Yeah, just to follow up, so maybe it's not very necessary to call it mindfulness practice when you say, for example, storytelling.
Yes.
It's not necessarily a mindfulness practice or listening to music together or,
Yes.
I don't know, walking together.
Yes.
Or listening mindfully, but we don't have to use the term mindfulness.
That's very true.
Type of mindfulness.
Exactly. And so I call that stealth ways of bringing in the practices, where I don't necessarily name this as a contemplative exercise, but those who are in the room notice all of a sudden we've paused. We've invited some moments of just reflection, right? Reflection is a neutral term if you're willing to do that. And there's all kinds of questions we may have about, are we appropriating certain things from one set of, kind of traditions and dropping them in ways that we might have questions about. I think those are real and important questions. I also think that these practices that I'm describing are really human practices that help deepen human capacities, like coming into a sense of your embodied being, deepening your capacity to concentrate, listening more effectively. Right? Who doesn't need these practices today? The capacity to sort of sustain your focus in a world of many distractions. So there are ways that these practices, in fact, people who are good teachers often just have always used practices like some version of these, having students pause and write reflectively. So there's some of these things partake of are very similar to basic ways of helping people deepen understanding. And then some are more refined. And one of the things that we might do is really ask ourselves, how do we name the origin of these practices, and how do we name the cultural sort of traditions that we are drawing on? And how do we create a space for reflection about, is this a way of helping us learn from cultures who are generous enough to share these practices with us and honor them by having our own deep commitment to how and thoughtfully integrating them in ways that we think are valid and respectful? Or are we maybe appropriating, or are we exploiting in some way? Can we have a conversation about it? For me, mindfulness and contemplative ways of teaching and learning, more than being about telling people, here's what you need to do, it's more about creating a space where complexity can live and thrive. We need spaces where complexity can live and thrive. Our world is replete with all kinds of new complexities that we, culturally and in terms of how we educate, are really not well prepared to meet. Just today I was thinking about this idea of deterritorialization. All right, how many of you are familiar with this term? It's come up in some areas of philosophy, some areas of anthropology, but it's this idea that many of us, and once I read it, I was like, okay, I feel that. It's this idea that with globalization, the modern globalization movement, many of us are feeling disconnected from, like we feel radically connected with people all over the globe through our social media involvements, but we might not know our neighbor. We might not be comfortable talking to the person that picks up our mail every day. We're moving like this away from, or we might not know the cultural histories, how our neighborhoods got constituted, whether or not there were some racism and some segregation battles fought through which this neighborhood was created, the one I live in and pay rent for or pay a mortgage to. Like, not knowing those histories is a feature of modern life. And it leaves a lot of us feeling a little anxious, actually. So that's just one of the dimensions that'll be in a classroom that we enter. Some of us are feeling a little unmoored. Most of us are feeling at least somewhat unmoored. And it's a question of degree. Some of us are unmoored from cultures we've migrated away from. Some of us just because we've been a little bit too clued into this device all day long. So those kinds of dynamics, having spaces where you can say, let's drop in, let's ground, let's create a sense that we are here as human beings with faces and names, together trying to learn. And from there we can hold, well, I don't know exactly if in some ways these practices might seem to be, somewhat appropriated. I'm gonna sit with that hard question, right? If that's a challenge someone raises. Rather than saying, well, here's the answer and your question, I've got it all down. Can I hold and honor the question? Yeah, here in the
Speaking of question,
yes.
so as you've been talking, will you be giving this talk to the students? Could be quite useful.
If anybody has any connections, I'm happy to go to DC. I actually do a lot of talks with judges. So far, no one on the U.S. Supreme Court, but actually Arizona Supreme Court judges. One of my good friends in this field of contemplative practice and law is a former state of Utah Supreme Court justice. Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court is also a Zen priest. Actually, he opens a Zendo every morning in Utah. He's no longer on the bench. So this is just to say, I don't do this yet, but there's a network across the country of people in law who are aware that our system is very broken in many ways, and yet it's maybe the best system we have for this kind of complex engagement around difficult issues, right? We need a legal system, but we also need it to be a little bit better. And so people are bringing these practices in. Justine and I are both law professors. In fact, that's how we met on a panel many years ago. And we're still doing this work of trying to figure out how to teach more effectively and how to bring innovative practices in. So I'm working with judges, prosecutors, defense counsel in California and across the country, trying to find different ways of doing this. We haven't yet gotten the ear of the Supreme Court, but we have colleagues who are in Congress. Tim Ryan's a congressman who has written a book called The Mindful Nation. You may know about Tim, they have been here. So these are things that are happening across the country. As you well know, our problems are great. And these practices are being brought in appropriate ways to help create conditions that might help us deepen our capacity to address them. You had your hand up there.
Angela,
Hi.
I can agree more than your opinion about creating the safe space is the key factor. And if I can I have some kind of maybe the intention to make a space or to be mindful or to be compassionate.
Yes.
Is the key.
Yes.
One day I had a teaching compassion meditation for 4 years old kids. So I didn't do mindfulness and compassion meditation, but I let them to fold like a heart with a with a paper,
Uh-huh.
and then you put it on the heart, and you will send your heart to many people.
Yes.
And then they were doing. They were doing it.
Yes.
So, at that time, I realized that, oh, maybe the concept or the way is not important. It's
Exactly.
maybe our intention.
Yes, thank you so very much. Intentionality is so important. And I just want to, for example, as I close, the kind of intentionality I bring to all of this is curiosity, gratitude, the love that is what justice looks like in public. To use, to paraphrase both Martin Luther King on the one hand, who said that justice, in fact, was love, correcting that which stands against love. That is a definition of justice, right? So we think these might be disparate ideas, that there isn't a place for love when we think about social justice, but we know there is. And we know that these practices, whether they be metta practices, loving kindness, or just the compassion that arises from deeply being with your own body, embodied presence, there's a place for that when we are trying to actually turn to these hard questions of how do we resolve issues of injustice in our time. There's a place for each of us to actually bring that more into the work of finding ways that everybody can thrive. That to me is what justice, whether social justice or otherwise, is about. Creating systems in our social world in which everybody can find a way to thrive. And being mindful of those ways, that the things that stand in the way of it, and standing up with love against those things that stand in the way. So I thank you all for having this, giving me this opportunity to come and share with me. And again, I'm available and happy to answer any other questions that may arise, as I know we're out of time. But thank you so much. Thank you so much.